Welcome to Ismaili Gnosis Chats. This episode is a conversation about the article, The Prophet Unveiled, what the Quran tells us about Muhammad.
All right, you ready for a deep dive today? Because we are going deep.
Let's do it.
We are talking about the Prophet Muhammad, but not like the usual biographical stuff we always hear about.
Right.
This is about his spiritual role,
Yeah.
as understood through the Quran and specifically through the lens of Ismaili Islam.
Exactly. So we're diving into this article from Ismaili Gnosis. It's called The Prophet Unveiled, what the Quran says about the Prophet Muhammad. B.O.
I like it, unveiled. Very nice.
Yeah, it's kind of pushing us to rethink some of those assumptions we might have about the prophet, going beyond just this simple label of messenger
Right.
to uncover a much deeper meaning.
Yeah, so let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
So the article starts off by tackling this big misconception that's out there.
Yeah.
The prophet's only role was to deliver the Quran.
Right.
But they bring up verse 2.151.
Yes. And it lists several of the prophet's duties. Right. Revealing the Quran being just one amongst many. Exactly. And it even mentions purification teaching. It kind of paints this picture of the prophet revealing a way of being, not just delivering a text.
Right. It's like
He's a guide illuminating the path.
it's the difference between like a friend giving directions versus a friend being like, I'll walk with you.
Exactly.
You know, you get so much more from that shared journey.
Exactly. And that's further emphasized in verse 42.52, highlighting how important it is to have someone illuminate the way for you.
This makes me wonder then if the prophet's job is to guide us to the straight path. What happens to all of us after he's gone?
That's a great question.
Like the need for that guidance doesn't just disappear, does it?
It doesn't. And the article really dives right into that. And it goes beyond just guidance.
Right.
It argues that the prophet's authority stems directly from God.
Okay.
So verse 4.80 states, and this is powerful, he who obeys the messenger obeys God.
Wow. So it's about submission to the prophet's judgment, his decrees,
Exactly.
as extensions of God's will.
It's a whole other level of obedience, isn't it?
It is. It makes you think about, like, what does submission obedience really mean?
Right.
Beyond just, like, following the rules. What does it look like to really surrender to a higher authority
In our everyday lives.
in our everyday lives?
And this reverence, this deep respect, is reflected in how believers are supposed to act around him. Lowering their voices, approaching with humility.
Right.
All of that's there in verse 49.1 through 3.
Right. I can just imagine being in the presence of someone so profoundly connected to the divine.
You'd be in awe.
And speaking of the divine, the article then gets into how the prophet embodies God's mercy and forgiveness.
Absolutely. It's a central theme in the article.
Yeah.
Verse 3.31 suggests that God's love and forgiveness are accessed through following the prophet.
Okay.
He becomes this conduit to the divine.
Almost like a gatekeeper.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting for me.
Okay.
When the article says that the prophet himself forgives and pardons. Now, isn't that God's domain?
It seems like a contradiction, right?
It does.
But the article points to verses like 3.159, where God both commands seeking forgiveness and instructs the prophet to pardon.
Okay.
So it's almost as if there are these two levels of forgiveness at play.
It's like the earthly and the divine.
The earthly and the divine, exactly.
Right. That is fascinating. And then it gets even more intriguing when the article talks about how believers would offer gifts to the prophet, like tzedakah,
Right.
to seek his blessings and closeness to God.
Yes. Verses 9.99 and 9.103 come to mind.
Yeah.
They highlight these acts as rituals of purification.
Okay.
It even gets into how scholar Fred Donner suggests that the original concept of zakah might have been closer to these offerings to the prophet than just simple charity as we understand it today.
So it's not about like the money itself.
No.
It's about the intention behind it.
It's about that spiritual connection.
Right. Because I think when we hear, offerings and things like that, it's like, wait, are we saying that money buys you blessings?
Right.
And it's clearly much deeper than that.
And remember, the prophet himself, as highlighted in 9.128, is described using the same attributes as God merciful, kind delight. Right? Like a direct reflection.
Yes.
But this brings us to a big question then. If the prophet embodies these divine qualities,
Yeah.
how do we reconcile that with him still being human?
Right.
How does the article tackle that apparent contradiction?
It uses a beautiful analogy.
Okay.
The analogy of a polished mirror.
Okay.
Just as a mirror reflects an image, the prophet, through his absolute devotion and submission to God, becomes a vessel reflecting those divine attributes. And that reflection, that light, doesn't just disappear,
Wow.
even after the prophet's physical presence is gone.
So it's like If the prophet is the perfectly polished mirror reflecting God's light, what does that mean for us?
That's a great question.
Are we also meant to be mirrors?
Right.
How do we polish our own mirrors to better reflect those qualities? It's a powerful image to reflect on, and this need for guidance, for that connection to the divine, doesn't just end because the prophet's physical lifetime did.
Right.
That brings us to a very crucial concept, particularly in Ismaili Islam, the role of the Imam.
Okay, I'm very intrigued. Tell me more about this, Imam.
Okay, so the Imam, right, it's a concept that I think sometimes gets simplified, reduced to just, the person leading prayers at the mosque.
Right.
But we're talking about something much, much deeper.
Right, like if that need for guidance for that connection is ongoing, there's got to be more to it. It can't just end there.
And the article really gets into that, this idea of like a direct continuation of that spiritual guidance that the prophet embodied.
Okay, I like that.
So they draw this really interesting distinction between what they call legislative prophecy and spiritual guardianship.
Okay.
So the prophet Muhammad as the final prophet, right? He brought that final revelation of the Quran.
Right.
That's the legislative part.
Okay.
He delivered the divine law, the guidance for how to live.
Like the rule book.
Right, exactly. But it's the spiritual guardianship that continues.
Okay.
And that's through the Imam.
So it's like, okay, we have the Quran, this incredible guidebook for life.
Yeah.
But like life is constantly changing, evolving.
Right.
We need someone to help us apply those timeless principles to like what's going on right now.
Exactly. And the article really argues that, while the prophet's role as this law-giving prophet ended with him, the need for interpretation for that ongoing spiritual connection that didn't just vanish.
Right.
And that's where the Imam comes in.
Okay, so it's not just about following rules.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the why behind them.
The deeper meaning behind them.
Yeah, and like how do we apply them in a way that's actually relevant to us?
Exactly.
And having a guide who embodies that light keeps the faith alive.
Keep it dynamic, right?
Yeah, it's not just some dusty old book on a shelf.
Right, and the article even hints at this.
Yeah.
Saying that, the Quran itself doesn't spell out every single detail for how to live your life.
Right.
It provides those principles, the values, the ethical framework.
Right.
But it's the Imam that helps us interpret and apply those teachings.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So the Imam is not just like a religious figurehead.
Right.
Someone that you just like respect from afar.
Exactly.
They actually embody that same divine connection, that light that the Prophet Muhammad had.
Exactly. And the article is very specific in referring to a hereditary Ismaili Imam.
Okay.
Emphasizing that unbroken lineage from the Prophet Muhammad, ensuring that purity of the spiritual connection.
Okay. Now, the lineage part is where things always get a little
Tricky,
right?
Yeah.
Because historically, we've got all these different branches of Islam, each with their own understanding of who those rightful successors are.
Right. And to be honest, unpacking all of those could be like a whole other deep dive series.
Right, exactly.
For now, I think it's important to note that this article is really focusing on the Ismaili perspective.
Okay.
And in their interpretation, the lineage goes through the Prophet's daughter Fatima and her husband Ali.
Okay, and that line continues to this day, right?
It does.
With the Aga Khan.
That's right.
Who, many listeners might recognize from his humanitarian work around the world.
Exactly. And it brings us to another point that the article makes this idea that the Imam is present in the world guiding believers.
Guiding believers.
And this challenges this notion that nothing and no one should be revered except God.
Which makes sense because if the Imam embodies those attributes, acts as that conduit to God,
right,
wouldn't there naturally be a reverence?
Right. It's not about worshiping the Imam.
Right.
But it's about recognizing that connection to something greater.
Exactly. And the article even talks about how Ismaili Muslims have that profound love and respect for the Aga Khan.
Yes.
Not as God, but as that divinely guided guide.
Exactly. Remember how we talked about believers were supposed to behave around the Prophet, lowering their voices, approaching with humility? It suggests that this same reverence applies to the Imam.
Wow. Okay, so we've really gone deep on the Ismaili perspective here.
We have.
But I'm also thinking about our listeners who might be, from different backgrounds.
Sure.
What's the takeaway for them?
Right.
Why should someone who's not Ismaili care about any of this?
And the article does touch on that towards the end.
Okay.
Emphasizing that even if you're not Ismaili, just understanding this concept of spiritual authority.
Okay.
And its role in Islam sheds light on the diversity of thought within the faith.
it dismantles that idea that there's only one way to understand Islam,
Exactly.
which unfortunately is something we hear all too often.
Which we do. And I think it's about, being open to those different interpretations, engaging with them thoughtfully, expanding our understanding, even if we don't agree with everything.
Yeah.
It challenges us to look at our own beliefs more deeply, don't you think?
I love that.
Yeah.
It's about understanding, not necessarily agreeing.
Right.
But I guess that still kind of leaves me with this question of, okay, if we're talking about Ismaili Muslims today,
Yeah.
what does it actually look like
Right.
to live with that awareness of a present living Imam?
How does this play out?
What does it mean to have that connection?
Yeah, because it's one thing to talk about it, theoretically.
Yeah.
But how does it actually manifest?
Okay, tell me everything. So we were talking about what it actually looks like, to have that connection to a living Imam.
Right, because it can't just be theoretical, right?
Right.
It's got to be something real, something tangible.
Yeah.
And the article really takes us there from that theoretical to the practical.
Okay.
Remember all those roles of the Prophet Muhammad? We talked about guidance, forgiveness,
No.
judgment, even receiving offerings.
Yeah.
The article suggests that all of these functions are still active, but now through the Imam.
Okay, now hold on. So you're saying it's not just that the Imam is this figurehead, this distant authority figure.
Right.
There's an actual connection there for Ismaili Muslims today.
That's exactly it. And the article is very explicit about that,
Okay.
saying that for Ismaili Muslims, those roles are filled by the Aga Khan.
Wow.
He is seen as that source of guidance, the intercessor, the conduit to the divine, just as the Prophet Muhammad was in his time.
Wow. That is powerful stuff. But then you can't help but think about the responsibility then that falls on the Imam to have, millions of people looking to you for that spiritual nourishment, that direction.
It's a heavy weight to carry.
That's a heavy weight to carry.
For sure. And the article makes it clear that, it's not about blind obedience either.
Okay.
The Aga Khan's guidance encourages critical thinking, reflection, personal growth.
Right.
It's about empowering individuals to find their own path within that framework of faith.
So it's not about being told exactly what to do in every situation.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's having those tools, that wisdom to sort of navigate all the complexities of life
Right.
through that spiritual lens.
Exactly. And this is what I think makes it so relevant, even for someone who might not be Ismaili. At the end of the day, we're all grappling with these big questions, meaning purpose, how to live ethically. And I think what the article is suggesting is that having that guide
Right.
who embodies those values,
Right.
who offers that spiritual perspective, it's invaluable.
I love how you bring it back to this universal human experience.
Yeah.
It's we all have that compass.
We do.
But a compass doesn't work unless you know how to use it.
Exactly.
Unless you know how to orient yourself.
Right.
And it's almost like in this context, the Imam is that person who can help you read that compass
Yes.
and make sure that you're headed in a direction
Make sure you're calibrated.
that aligns with you.
Because even a compass, right,
Yeah.
needs that calibration every now and then.
This has been incredible. I feel like we've explored so much.
Me too.
We challenged some misconceptions about the Prophet Muhammad.
Yeah.
We unpacked this whole concept of the Imam in Ismaili Islam. Absolutely.
And I feel like we've just scratched the surface.
Oh, we've just begun to dive in.
Oh, there's so much more to learn.
There's always more to explore.
Well, listeners, it sounds like we have a lot more deep dives ahead of us.
Many more.
If this sparked your curiosity, remember, keep questioning, keep exploring those different perspectives, and keep diving deep with us.